Hello everyone and happy Friday. I'm Nizzahon, and each and every Friday I post a new MTG top 10 list. This week we're looking at a creature type, Clerics. I was inspired to do this one because Amonkhet brought a whole bunch of new Clerics to the table, 14 in total, and I'm sure we'll see more of them in Hour of Devastation. It makes sense because Clerics are generally people who are in official positions within a religious group or organization, and in Amonkhet the religious beliefs of the people seem very important. Clerics are a pretty old creature type in Magic, with almost 400 of them having been printed, and in fact, as a kid, I actually remember learning what the word cleric meant because of Magic when I opened up Atalia Samite Master as my rare in a pack of Invasion. The cleric creature type was once even supported with tribal bonuses back in Onslaught block, but since then has appeared on cards mostly as a class aspect of the card, rather than the primary creature type of a card. Most clerics appear in white, with black as the next most common color, but over time, clerics have shown up in all the colors, as Amonkhet illustrates. However, clerics are still predominantly white, as you will see from this list. Before we get started, let me remind you very quickly on how I score these lists. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they have attained, with Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. The cards in this list are numbered 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. I consider Legacy and Vintage Championships events as Pro Tour Top 8s as well, so that those formats can be properly represented. In the description, you can find all clerics who scored 10 or more points but didn't quite make the list. Before I get started, try your hand at guessing the number 1 card in this list. I don't think it's an easy one to guess. Now, on to number 10. At number 10, we have a relative newcomer to Magic, Containment Priest. Printed in Commander 2014, players of Eternal formats immediately knew she would have an impact. This is because decks that cheat creatures into play are pretty common in those formats, whether they are put into play with Show and Tell, Sneak Attack, or Reanimation effects. Those are key strategies. Containment Priest has managed to make it to number 10 on the list, despite the fact that it is a pretty new card and is only legal in Vintage and Legacy, and their events in Vintage and Legacy are few and far between. This is because she has become a staple there. You can find it in the sideboard of basically any deck that can cast it in Legacy, with Blue-White Miracles and Death and Taxes most frequently playing her, since those are decks that need a way to stop the faster combo decks that cheat creatures into play. It sees play in Vintage for the same reasons, showing up in Eldrazi aggro decks and Monastery Mentor decks that most frequently. Its most impressive showing was picking up 3 top 8s at the Vintage Championships in 2015, and it doesn't seem like it's going to stop appearing in Legacy and Vintage, even with the banning of top in Legacy. On to number 9. At number 9, we have Loxodon Hierarch. The only elephant on this list, as you might imagine. It came out in Ravnica, which was sort of when Wizards began really pushing creatures for the first time, after spells had been more powerful than creatures for about a decade. Loxodon Hierarch at the time felt really pushed. A 4-mana 4/4 with all kinds of upside was great, and it was one of the best creatures from Ravnica. I think that if this creature were reprinted in Standard of today, it would actually still be a card people wanted to play, which is not something that is true of all creatures that are this old. The life gain and the regeneration are both pretty powerful effects to have on a 4/4. At Pro Tour Charleston in 2006, a block-constructed Pro Tour, the Loxodon appeared in 3 of the top 8 deck lists. It also did incredibly well in Standard, picking up 5 top 8s at Worlds in 2005, primarily appearing in a deck that made a bunch of Saproling tokens and used a card called Glare of Subdual to lock down the opponent. Meanwhile, the Hierarch could bash for 4 a turn. It made a big impact on Extended 2, becoming the top curve of Zoo decks when it was first printed, but also appearing in Rock decks, Doran, the Siege Tower decks, and Life from the Loam decks. It was just a quality card in all of those decks because it provided you with a big beater who also brought you time with life gain, and that means even if your opponent had removal, you get some value out of the card. And in the aggressive decks, it could sacrifice itself to save the rest of your creatures from board sweepers. The Hierarch also picked up a 1 Grand Prix top 8 at a Legacy Pro Tour, indicating just how strong of a creature it was at this time. After Extended it ended in 2011, the Hierarch hasn't done much, though in 2014 it did manage to pick up a single GP top 8 in a Birthing Pod deck at a Modern Grand Prix. Hasn't done anything since then, though, and while it was ultra powerful in the time, the Hierarch has since been surpassed by even more powerful creatures in the non-rotating formats. At number 8, we have Fiend Hunter, who was an Oblivion Ring on a stick, making him an incredibly good card. At the Innistrad Block Pro Tour Alvison Restored, he picked up 3 of the top 8s. He was a dominant card in Standard, though, appearing in white weenie decks, green-white aggro decks, and Birthing Pod decks primarily. Birthing Pod decks had amazing toolbox creatures since it could tutor so easily, and obviously Fiend Hunter was the one you searched up when your opponent played a problem creature. In aggro decks, Fiend Hunter is nice because you can play removal and develop your board at the same time when you play him. He also appeared in modern versions of Birthing Pod decks, and after the pod got banned out of Modern, began appearing in 2 other decks that have since emerged and also run a bunch of toolbox creatures. One of these utilizes Court of Calling, and the other uses Collected Company. It has already picked up a couple of Grand Prix top 8s in Modern this year, and in February in an Abzan Company deck, and one in early April in a toolbox deck. It also picked up 2 Legacy top 8s back in 2013 in Death and Taxes decks, but it seems more likely that the Hunter continues to pick up Modern Grand Prix as time goes on. At number 7, we have another recent newcomer to this list, and the only card on this list that is still legal in Standard, Selfless Spirit. It's an incredibly good card. There's not a whole lot more to say about it. It's a 2-mana 2/1 flyer with a nice aggressive cost, and it can also sacrifice itself and utilize an ability that is a huge problem for opponents to deal with, giving the whole team indestructible. This means that it dodges all board sweeping that doesn't exile or give -X to creatures. In Standard, it also comboed stupidly well with Avacyn, where you could sacrifice him to give your whole team indestructible. The sacrifice would flip Avacyn and have her do 3 to the whole board, but your creatures didn't care about the damage because they'd be indestructible. It was also a nice card to hit off of Collected Company, because if your opponent played a board sweeper or even a removal spell in some cases, you could search this guy up and protect your board. And that's where he got his start in Standard, in Collected Company decks. Spirit decks also became a thing in Standard for a while thanks to the existence of Spellqueller primarily, and Selfless Spirit made it into those decks as well. A little more recently, a blue-white flash deck emerged that plays like an aggro deck and plays a bunch of low-costed flyers with upside, so it's more of an aggro control deck because many of these creatures actually have flash. It has also found its way into some versions of Mardu vehicles, most recently. The Spirit's impact has already been felt in Modern, where it has appeared in Elf decks, which are notoriously weak to cards like Pyroclasm, so having a card like Selfless Spirit helps defend against that, as well as in Hate Bear decks. But the deck it has done the most in Modern is in Collected Company, where it serves the same role as it did in Standard Collected Company decks. Since the Spirit is still in Standard and already making its presence felt on a list like this one, and is seeing play in Modern, there is no telling how high the Cleric will climb on this list. At number 6, we have Orzhov Pontiff, who has the interesting haunt mechanic, meaning it has an Enter the Battlefield ability, and also that it haunts another creature when it dies. That is, you sort of attach it to the other creature, and then when that creature dies, you get the trigger again. His ability is a very good one. He can pump your whole team or weaken your opponent's whole team. And block, Saproling tokens were everywhere, so playing the Pontiff was a pretty good idea if you could cast it. And 3 decks at the Block Constructed Pro Tour in 2006 ran the Pontiff and put up top 8s. Interestingly, Orzhov Pontiff didn't do a ton in Standard of his time, only picking up a single Pro Tour top 8. Extended is the place where he saw some success, though, as a result of the metagame. Elf-based decks that ran a card called Glimpse of Nature, which basically allowed them to draw their entire library in a single turn, were a problem, and the Pontiff could kill the majority of elves just by coming into play, and as a result, he was in a ton of sideboards and Extended up until Glimpse of Nature got banned. Even the elf decks themselves ran him because he was such a good card in the mirror. In Modern, though, is where he's done the most work. Just like Selfless Spirit and Fiend Hunter, he was a very good card in Birthing Pod decks because of the utility he could have at any point during the game. Obviously, Selfless Spirit wasn't around during Birthing Pod, but I mean decks, toolbox decks, basically. If you needed to pump your whole team for lethal, you could search for your Orzhov Pontiff. Need to kill all of your opponent's creatures, you could search for Orzhov Pontiff. When the pod eventually got banned, the Pontiff saw success in the same sort of decks that Fiend Hunter and Selfless Spirit have, Court of Calling decks, and Collected Company decks, where he is still seeing play today. At number 5, we have the only non-white cleric to make our list, Deceiver Exarch. All of the other clerics on this list are at least part white. Deceiver Exarch saw play for one reason. The card called Splinter Twin existed, and together they created an infinite combo that made infinite Deceiver Exarch tokens and could swing for lethal. Sounds kind of like the Saheeli Rai Felidar Guardian combo in Standard. This combo first existed in Standard, but didn't quite have the success it would have in other formats, registering only a single Grand Prix top 8, though versions of the deck did do a little bit of work in Star City Games tournaments and the like. The modern version of the deck was far more consistent, though, and could play powerful cards like Remand, Lightning Bolt, Cryptic Command, and the additional card that could be a combo piece with Splinter Twin, Pestermite, and this made the deck much more consistent. The combo emerged almost immediately after the creation of Modern and was viewed as one of the iconic decks of the format. Unfortunately for it, it was a little too powerful and prevalent in the format, and Wizards chose to ban Splinter Twin in 2015, and since then the Exarch hasn't seen the light of day in competitive Magic. At number 4, we have Sin Collector. The Collector has a powerful effect against control decks, not only getting rid of the best instant or sorcery in their hand, but also giving you important information about your opponent's hand. Control decks themselves played it too, as it was a way to disrupt combo decks, and even taking removal away from more aggressive decks isn't usually a bad idea. At Pro Tour Dragon's Maze in 2013, a block Pro Tour, the Collector was powerful enough to pick up 4 top 8s. In Standard, it saw a solid amount of play in Aristocrats, Reanimator, Junk, Esper Control, and also Orzhov Control. It also saw a little bit of play in Modern, where it was a good utility creature for, you guessed it, Birthing Pod decks. I didn't realize before making this list how many Clerics were in Birthing Pod decks, but there you go. Anyway, it was a good creature to tutor up against opponents with lots of instants and sorceries, like the other cards that were common in Pod. It has since transitioned into Collected Company and Court of Calling decks, where it is still seeing a bit of play. At number 3, we have Arishan Cleric. If you told me you thought Arishan Cleric would even make this list, I would probably think you were a liar, because, seriously, Arishan Cleric, it wasn't even a main board card in Limited all the time. I mean, I remember seeing it in a lot of sideboards back when it was in Standard, but still, I didn't think this would be one where it made top 3 on a list. Cards like Arishan Cleric are one of the reasons why I like to use the method I use for these top 8s. These lists aren't in order of what clerics are the most powerful in a vacuum, as you know if you're watching this. They're the clerics most played at the highest level, and in looking at these cards, we get to look back at Magic's history and find strange inclusions like this one, and discuss why and how some of these cards were played despite not looking the most impressive. Basically, doing a top 10 based on how much things were played allows for both me and you to learn a lot about Magic's past, and in some way, this can help us better evaluate cards in the future. This sort of thing shows us that metagames are incredibly important in figuring out how good a card is. With Arishan Cleric, for example, it existed in a Standard that had a lot of aggro decks that could do damage very quickly, and most of the creatures those decks ran, or at least a lot of them, were 2/2s. Arishan Cleric was great because it not only gained you life, which bought you more time, it could also block commonly played aggressive creatures all day. This meant it was a great sideboard card, and even sometimes a mainboard card for the control decks of Standard like Esper Dragons and Dark Jeskai. Combo decks ran him too for the same reason, most notably Rally the Ancestors deck, who were trying to buy more time before they could cast their Rally, and it also has an Enter the Battlefield ability and comes back with Rally the Ancestors itself. Because there were such fast decks in this format and the Cleric could block their low curve so well, it was an incredibly commonly played card in Standard for a while, and a card like this Cleric is worth keeping in mind if we ever find ourselves in a similar Standard, as some random 2-mana 1/3 who gains a bit of life may become much better than it would otherwise be. At number 2, we have Geist of St. Traft, which I figured would be number 1 when I started this list. As you can see, he didn't quite make it here at number 2. We talked about Loxodon Hierarch early on in this list as one of the first really pushed creatures in Magic. Well, Geist was pushed even harder. A 3-mana 2/2 with Hexproof is not anything incredible, but one that makes a 4/4 Angel token every time he attacks is, Geist can quickly close out games if you don't have a way to stop him. He can, of course, be blocked by other creatures, but that would assume that your creatures haven't been removed or otherwise incapacitated, or Geist hasn't been given an evasive ability to allow him to keep swinging. The hexproof really means that combat is the only easy way to get rid of him. Board sweepers do the job, but blow up your board too. It was clear Geist was stupid powerful from the very beginning, and he picked up 3 top 8s at the Block Pro Tour Avacyn Restored, appearing in both aggro decks and a Miracle deck. It was perhaps the best creature in Standard when it was around, and as a result, any deck running both blue and white wanted to play him. This included White Weenie aggro decks, Blue-White control decks, Pure Steel Paladin decks, Illusion decks, Delver of Secret decks, Esper control decks, Human decks, and so on. Geist also has a respectable resume in Modern, appearing again in a wide variety of decks. Zoo aggro decks, Cobblade, Patriot aggro, Delver of Secret decks again, and most recently in Nahiri control decks. Even Legacy isn't safe from Geist, where he's picked up a few top 8s in Stoneblade and Standstill decks. Geist hasn't made a top 8 yet in 2017, but I think it's safe to assume he'll get at least one this year in some format, and if he can do that, he will be very close to passing the number 1 card on this list, which is Aethersworn Canonist. Another hate bear to complement the Containment Priest who came in at number 10. In the Canonist's case, she makes any deck that isn't made up of primarily artifact spells unable to cast more than 1 spell a turn. The Canonist was completely unplayed in block and managed only 1 Grand Prix top 8 when she was in Standard, appearing as a 1-of in the sideboard, so in the beginning it didn't look like the Canonist would do a whole lot. However, she found a home in most other formats. In Extended, she appeared in Affinity decks, since the effect was largely one-sided, as well as in sideboards of other decks. In Modern, she showed up in sideboards of artifact-centric decks that made the effect one-sided, and it was an effect that was quite powerful against a multitude of decks in the format, including especially combo decks. She has appeared alongside Arcbound Ravager in the sideboard of many affinity decks in Modern, and in Birthing Pod decks, she actually found her way into the main board, since, as we've noted numerous times, Birthing Pod decks were pretty capable of searching up toolbox hate creatures, and the Canoness is definitely one of those. However, Legacy is the place where the Canonesses flourish the most, in a format that has the most prominent Hate Bear style deck called Death and Taxes. She is one of the many hate creatures that the deck plays. She also shows up in lots of sideboards, such as in Blue-White Miracles and Stoneblade. The Canoness picked up a top 8 in Legacy as recently as January of 2017, so I think she will continue to build her resume, but she has only a 1-point lead over Geist, so this is something that could change very soon. Geist could make number 1 on this list in the end. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. I will, of course, be back next week with another one. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to hit the like button. In the comments, let me know what your favorite cleric is. If you want to make sure you catch more MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. You can also find more like this one over on the Ether Hub, another channel I contribute to. My content is also sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all things Magic. You can use my discount code Nizzahon5 in their store to get a 5% discount. Thanks for watching.